Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, welcome to a night of poetry and fiction at the inaugural Calaboo Creative Writing Workshop at University of West Indies Cave Hill. We want to thank the faculty of the Humanities and Education for hosting the workshop here. And also to explain that when we say Calaboo, we know most folks are familiar with the dish, but just give a little background on Calaboo. Calaboo began as the premier journal of the Black American South in 1976, and since then it's expanded to publish authors within the African diaspora internationally, and also to include a book series, an annual international conference, and this event as well, so to cultivate new and emerging talent. So we appreciate you joining us here tonight. We ask that at this time you turn off or silence your cell phones, and as we have the readings, we ask that you make note of any questions that you might have, because this reading will be followed by a Q&A period. And to offer a welcome, we have Dr. Mark McLaughlin.
Thank you. Well, visitors, workshop leaders, colleagues, including the head of LLML, guests, ladies, gentlemen. It's my pleasant duty this evening to welcome you all to this Night of Poetry and Fiction, which inaugurates the 2014 Calaboo Creative Writing Workshop, the first to be held here in Barbados. The University of West Indies, Faculty of Humanities and Education, and Department of Language, Linguistics and Literature, in association with the journal Calaboo and with Professor Charles Rowe, who unfortunately is unable to be with us tonight due to illness, are all proud to be able to host this workshop, and we all hope that it will not be the first and the last to be held here in Barbados. I was privileged to meet with Professor Rowe when he visited last year to check the facilities and to introduce the idea of having the workshop here. I was happy to hear that Barbados, along with London, UK, were chosen to be locations for the first Calaboo workshops outside the US. The London workshop, I think, took place last year. I welcome the two workshop leaders, Maza Mendis for prose fiction and Gregory Cardno for poetry, and I trust that you, will enjoy the workshop and your stay in Barbados. The two workshop leaders, who are also tonight's readers, will be properly introduced in a few minutes. I'm sure that I don't need to say too much about Calaboo itself. As you all know, it's a top literary journal. In fact, as tonight's program note on Calaboo tells us, it is now considered the premier literary and cultural journal of the African diaspora. It has been going since 1976 and has got better and more prestigious as the years and decades pass. Professor Rowell deserved the greatest credit and applause for starting it and keeping it going over the years. With that, I think you've really heard enough from me. All that remains is for me to welcome you all again and to wish everyone involved a successful workshop. And I know we will all enjoy tonight's program of readings. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. McLaughlin. And you'll see in your programs that the comment we had originally planned out. Dr. Charles Rowell, the founder and editor of Calaboo, gave a comment as a response, but he wasn't able to join us, unfortunately, but he's doing fine. He had to cancel his trip. But first, so we'll go ahead and introduce the readers. The first reader will be Maza Mendiste. Maza's debut novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, has been described as brave, lyrical, emotionally gripping, and poetic, transcendent and powerful, offering a memorable and heartbreaking story. The novel was selected as The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books. Maza's fiction can also be found in the pages of Calaboo, Granta, Guardian, and the New York Times, among other publications. In addition to her writing, for which she has been awarded several honors, as you can see on the program, Maza also served as a writer for the documentary project titled Girls Rising by 10 by 10 Films, which focuses on the power of providing access to education for girls worldwide. Her second novel, The Shadow King, is forthcoming. Please welcome me and join me with Maza Mendiste.
here. My workshop class and I are now in day 2 of this week and had our first workshop. And I'm just so thrilled to be here, so thrilled to have these students as my students in workshop. I think that I can speak for Gregory last night and for Jackson as well, how thrilled we are and how honored we are to have these particular group of students and writers with us. It was a tough competition to get in, and so we are really glad that all of you were able to make it. I'm going to read from my novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, which is set, which is set in 1974 during a communist-backed revolution in Ethiopia. Basically, if you can imagine what happened and is happening in Egypt and what is going on in Syria right now, it's very close to what happened in Ethiopia in 1974. My story centers around a family trying to deal with the chaos and the upheaval of that time. And one of my main characters is Hailu. He is a medical doctor and works for one of the biggest hospitals in Addis Ababa. And he has been ordered by the military regime and the dictator that has come into power to take care of a special prisoner. She is a young girl, maybe 16, 17. She has been interrogated and quite brutally. So he is told to take care of her and heal her so that she can go back into custody. And I will read a scene from one particular hospital shift with Hailu. The human heart, Hailu knew, can stop for many reasons. It is a fragile, hollow muscle the size of a fist, shaped like a cone, divided into 4 chambers, separated by a wall. Each chamber has a valve. Each valve has a set of flaps, as delicate and frail as wings. They open and close, steady and organized, fluttering against currents of blood. The heart is merely a hand that has closed around empty space, contracting and expanding. What keeps a heart going is the constant, unending act of being pushed and the relentless, anticipated response of pushing back. Pressure is the life force. Hailu understood that a change in the heart can stall a beat. It can flood arteries with too much blood and violently throw its owner into pain. A sudden jerk can shift and topple one beat onto another. The heart can attack. It can pound relentlessly on the walls of the sternum, swell and squeeze roughly against lungs until it cripples its owner. He was aware of the power and frailty of this thing he felt thumping now against his chest, loud and fast in his empty room. A beat, the first push and nudge of pressure in a heart he knew was generated by an electrical impulse in a small bundle of cells tucked into one side of the organ. But the pace of the syncopated beats is affected by feeling, and no one, least of all he, could comprehend the sudden, impulsive, lingering control emotions played on the heart. He had once seen a young patient die from what his mother insisted was a crumbling heart that had finally collapsed on itself. A missing beat can fell a man. A healthy heart can be stilled by nearly anything: hope, anguish, fear, love. A woman's heart is smaller, even more fragile than a man's. It wouldn't be so surprising then that the girl had died. Hailu would simply point to her heart. It would be enough to explain everything. He'd been alone in the room, the soldiers smoking outside. He could see their shadows lengthening over the bare and brittle lawn as the sun swung low, then lower, then finally sank under the weight of night. It was easy to imagine that the dark blanket outside had also swept into the hospital rooms, even though the lights were on. It was the stillness, the absolute absence of movement that convinced him that they too, this girl and he, were just an extension of the heaviness that lay beyond the window. She'd been getting progressively better, had begun to wake for hours at a time and gaze terrified at the two soldiers sitting across from her. The soldiers had watched her recovery with relief, then confusion, and eventually guilt. Hailu could see their shame, keeping them hunched over monotonous card games. It hadn't been so difficult to get the cyanide. He'd simply walked into the supply office behind the pharmacy counter and waved at the bored pharmacist and pulled the cyanide from a drawer that housed a dwindling supply of penicillin. Back in the room, Heidi prayed and made the sign of the cross over the girl. Then he opened her mouth and slipped the tiny capsule between her teeth. What happened next happened without the intrusion of words, without the clash of meaning and language. The girl flexed her jaw and tugged at his hand, so he was forced to meet her stare. Terror had made a home in this girl, and this moment was no exception. She shivered though the night was warm and the room hotter. Then she pushed her jaw shut, and Hailu heard the crisp snap of the capsule and the girl's muffled groan. The smell of almonds, sticky and sweet, rose from her mouth. She gasped for air, but Hailu knew she was already suffocating from the poison. She was choking. She took his hand and moved it to her heart and pressed it down. He wanted to think that last look before she closed her eyes was gratitude. It was only his nurse Almaz who'd recognized the vivid flush of the girl's face, the faint hint of bitter almonds, and known what had happened. She'd walked in just as Hailu was explaining to the soldiers how the electric shocks she'd received had damaged her internally. "Oh," Almaz said. "Yes," she collected herself. It was too much for her, too much infection. The soldiers were agitated. They paced back and forth. They asked Hailu again and again to explain exactly what had happened. "The infection was climbing from her feet to her heart," he repeated. "There was no way to stop it. She was too weak to fight it. But she was waking up," they said. "She was getting better," they said. "We told the colonel she would be back," they said. Hailu's palms were sweaty. He heard a ringing in his ears that seemed to get louder as he talked. He cleared his throat. "It was a surprise for all of us," he said. The girl's body was still in the bed, covered completely in a sheet. They hadn't filled out the necessary forms. The soldiers had yet to acknowledge these next steps. "You have to do something," one soldier demanded. He grabbed Hailu's arm and shook it. "We reported she'd be able to leave in a few days. People are expecting her." He tightened his grip. "Do something." "I'll write up the death certificate," Hailu said. "Everything will be explained there." "I'm a witness," Almaz said. There was nothing we could do. And yet now, Hailu sat at his desk in the dark. He'd been summoned to the jail officially. His presence was requested in writing, delivered to him by 3 skinny soldiers who spoke in unison. They'd walked into the hospital and gone to his office. They stood in a straight line, their shoulders even, their identical uniforms. The way they each planted their feet the exact same width apart and had their hands folded in front of them made Hailu think he was looking at triplets, though they were nothing alike in appearance. Watching them address him had been as confusing to Hailu as the order itself, handed down by a man most only knew as the colonel. "You were told to come in. We spoke to your friend," they said. Here is a written order. "Come to the jail tomorrow. Arrive by dawn," they said. "The colonel wakes up early." "What's this about?" Hailu looked at the ink signature at the bottom of the letter and tried to imagine the man whose hand moved across the page with such jagged sweeps of the pen. "I have to work tomorrow. I'm scheduled for surgery." 2 of them turned to look at the 3rd soldier. He stepped forward. Please don't disobey, he said. Should I bring a suitcase? Kailu asked. Most prisoners were ordered to bring a suitcase of clothes under the pretext that they'd return home eventually. Soldiers took the suitcases and added to their wardrobe, many of them wearing to bars and parties the clothes of those they'd executed. You won't need to, the third soldier said. Kailu tried not to think about the fact that no one he knew ever returned from a summons to jail. Tomorrow, they said before walking out of the office, don't disobey this time. Kailu sat in his chair with the lights off. He sat with his back straight as a tree, and he waited. Though for what, he wasn't sure. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lon. Our next reader will be Gregory Barlow. Gregory's first book, Totem, has been described as visionary, elegant, deeply autobiographical, offering gorgeous images that capture snapshots of the blue-collar world in language that is both urban and highbrow. The book is the winner of the American Poetry Review / Mornington First Book Prize. Gregory's poetry can also be found in the pages of Calhoun, American Poetry Review, last year's Tin House, among other publications. Gregory is the recipient of a number of fellowships, as are listed in your programs, and is a Agave Conan Fellow, as well as an associate editor of Calhoun. His second book of Poetry Digest is forthcoming. Please join me in welcoming Gregory Barlow.
Thanks, Tom. That was fantastic. I am, of course, honored to read for you all. I give readings all the time, and I'm never nervous. But as soon as I get in front of students, I freak out. So just be patient with me. Double Dutch. The girls turning double Dutch bob and weave like boxers pulling punches, shadowing each other, sparring across the slack cord, casting parabolas in the air. They whip quick as an infant's pulse, and the jumper, before she enters the winking, nods in time as if she has a notion to share, waiting for a chance to speak. But she's anticipating the upbeat, like a band leader counting off the tune they are about to swing into. The jumper stair-steps into mid-air as if she's jumping rope in low gravity, training for a lunar mission. Airborne a moment long enough to fit a second thought in, she looks caught in the mouth bones of a fish as she flutter floats into motion, like a figure in a stack of time-lapse photos thumbed alive. Once inside, the bells tied to her shoestrings rouse the gods who've lain in the dust since the Dutch acquired Manhattan. How she dances patterns like a dust-heavy bee, retracing its travels in scale before the hive. How the whole stunning contraption of girl and rope slaps and scoots like a paddle boat. Her misted skin arranges the light with each adjustment and flex, now heather-hued, now sheen, light listing on the fulcrum of a wrist and the bare jutted joints of elbow and knee, and the faceted surfaces of muscle, surfaces fracturing and reforming like a sun-tickled sleeve of running water. She makes jewelry of herself and garlands the ground with the shadows. So I've always been envious of painters. I wish I had some kind of visual dexterous talent, but that was not the case. It was not for me. So one of the ways I cope with this is by finding situations in which I can bring together poets and painters. So Georgia O'Keeffe had a vacation home on Lake George in upstate New York. She was married to the photographer Alfred Stieglitz. And you may know the writer Gene Toomer, the Harlem Renaissance writer Gene Toomer. Well, he was translating, doing a work of translation for this mystic philosopher, and he was friends with Stieglitz, and Stieglitz invited him up to Lake George to do these translations, while O'Keeffe coincidentally was there recovering from one of her breakdowns. And meet they did. This is called Restoring O'Keeffe. Something of a cure lay in that rustic lodge, clear exhaust off Lake George, winter ticking intaglios across the pane, and Gene Toomer tapping on his underwood in the guest room upstairs. All week she shared with him her soups and the baskets arrived from New York, remarked the nub of the citrus fruit against his hesitating palm, his tawny, graceless hand. Whether he leaped Gurdjieff's freedom of love into the frond of her ear, or Georgia had the servant tincture a remedy with the herb used to seduce, she pulled together one night with a Calvados and the snifter like a handful of flame, and Santa Fe whistling through the mind like a desert train. Tawny earth and ineluctable sky, she thought, though the window held the pallor of snow and moon crusted to the clearing beyond a grid of gaslight, cold hushing the cantor of Harlem, eliding his orbit with hers. You have a feminine soul, she said, cooling his face in her hands, measuring his eyes against a grave scale of sexuality. She held his head to her skirted hip. Cleft of peach, he said with his hands at the small of her back. So I'm going to read some from the forthcoming book digest. One of the things we know about slave narratives is that they're conventionally, they all start out with the same three words, I was born. And they also are attended by this list of authority figures who attest to the veracity of the authorship. So they'll say the titles of slave narratives will be written by himself to demonstrate that this was indeed the slave, the former slave, who is the author, and you'll have these people sort of verifying that. So I collaged a bunch of images from various slave narratives. This is called Written by Himself. I was born in minutes in a roadside kitchen, a skillet whispering my name. I was born to rainwater and lie. I was born across the river where I was borrowed with clothespins, a harrow tooth, broadside sewn in my shoes. I returned, though it please you, through no fault of my own, pockets filled with coffee grounds. I was born abandoned outdoors in the heat-shaped air drifting like spirits in old windows. I was born a fraction and a cipher and a ledger entry. I was an index of first lines when I was born. I was born waist deep, stubborn in the water, crying, ain't I a woman and a brother? I was born to this hall of mirrors, this horror story. I was born with a prologue of references, pursued by mosquitoes and thieves. I was born passing off the problem of the 20th century. I was born. I read minds before I could read fishes and loaves. I walked a piece of the way alone before I was born. So, my aunt, I get this email from my father's sister from Atlantic City. There's a picture in the email of this guy dressed in this really garish suit, and the subject line of the email is Atlantic City. Atlantic City pimp. And I'm trying to figure out why my aunt is sending me this picture. And then I realized that she intended it to go to her brother. And then I'm trying to figure out why was she sending it to my father? What is coded? What critique is coded in her sending this picture to my father? So this is the poem that comes out of that. Attachment, Atlantic City pimp. Left of the @ sign, the email address was ethnically gendered with a nonce noun, sista, which I have to confess I scoffed at, thinking it was from some self-discovering student of mine, before realizing it was my aunt who sent the JPEG from her cell phone. My aunt, who doesn't mind a bit of shell if it means getting all the crab meat, who is known to only leave behind enough of a tip to shame the waitstaff for their inattention. The subject line read AC Pimp, as if her painted nails and belly laugh made her expert in the fauna of pimps, a soul-stirred savant of things cold-blooded. As if she could divine an ivory-handled derringer holstered at his breast, icing the steel heart cognate to the gun, that twin ventriloquist of tinder and sulfur dust, that rhythmic and delicate organ pumping like a fist that has a knack for snake eyes and the superfluity of bruises that follow every spaghetti-strapped back talker's doubt. She must have thought she'd reached her brother, my father, who harbors like a gold molar a taste for robin egg and mauve pocket squares, a flourish of trim, a hand stitch, lapels check-striped and foreshortened like Tyrannosaurus arms, and ostrich print Stacey Adams to match. The modest feathered derby contrasting all those boas festooning street lamps and mailboxes. But my aunt is no mere expert. AC may have been a random tag, but that word pimp bore the import of all us do-wrong men. She was, in effect, signifying the kind of humor that waters the eye, the double talk, the shadow dialect. Like her spite-tinged smile at a bridal shower, her patina of derision enlivened the photo. My aunt, who refuses to settle for a man less Christian than she is, finds everywhere despicable men. Hence the dozens via email, the critique like a razor inside a roll of 20s, the currency of our vengeance economy. Perhaps there was an untroubled sea just beyond the garish casinos behind him, a stilt walker or mime outside the frame, a carnival and boardwalk where the horizon would be, and a tour bus full of people waving. Of all the images that might speak to something inside of her, this was the one she found worth saving. So, like so many poets, I make my living teaching. And one of the things that we're often called upon to do is to create courses, devise new courses. And so I'm in the habit of writing these course descriptions in it, and I find myself having fun thinking of courses, irreverent courses that I would love to actually teach, but I know there's no way I would ever get a chance to do so. So I let myself run with that for a little bit. This is called Shades of Green, Envy and Enmity in the American Cultural Imaginary. Images of the stud and the buck have an amorously crafted resonance, burnished by cultural anxieties, an addict's logic toward the habit they place in the mind and the mysteries we lay at their feet. This course will begin by focusing on models represented in the 1994 Charles Russell film, The Mask, and Ang Lee's 2003, The Hulk, the mojo and the genetic regression, the hypersexuality and the rage. These qualities are thrust and airbrushed onto the Bacchic body of the other as we fantasize our repression of them in ourselves, the unquiet threat of psychosomatic greening, a silk garret, an onanistic envy of the other's capacity for release, a monumental iconography of the hermetical black box of the brain. While we might be tempted to reduce these types to the pat dichotomy of comedy and tragedy, this course will examine the ways in which there is but one mask, a Janus-faced cleavage of thou art and thus am I, our goat-sung desires adrift in the wilderness, our telltale passions pulsing beneath the tulips and gladiolas in a mildewed hat box, the act of masking triumphal and deadly, trembling the bulb on its stem. I don't think I'll get to finish that. So, I live in New York, and one of the things that has disappointed me of late, lots of things to criticize New York for. One of the things that has disappointed me of late is that they totally redid the front of the Metropolitan Museum. There were these fountains that I am quite fond of, and they removed them completely and are doing something absolutely wacky. So it's a set in front of the Metropolitan Museum. And I'm going to add one of those things I hate when people do. This is a true story. This actually happened. Wishing well. Outside the Met, a man walks up, sun tweaking the brim sticker on his starter cap, and he says, "Pardon me, old school." He says, "You know, is this a wishing well?" "Yeah, son," I say sideways over my shrug. "Throw your bread on the water." I tighten my chest, wheezy as Rockaway beach sand with a pull of faux smoke from my e-cig to cozy the truculence I hotbox alone, and I am at the museum because it is not a bar. Because he appears not to have changed them in days, I eye the heel-chewed hems of his pants and think probably he will ask me for 50 cents any minute now. Wait for it. A smoke or something. Central Park displays the frisking transparency of autumn, tracing paper sky, leaves like eraser crumbs gum the pavement. As if deciphering celestial script, I squint and purse off toward the roofline of the museum aloof as he fists 2 pennies from his pockets, mumbling, and then aloud, "My man," he says, "Hey, my man, I'm going to make a wish for you too." I'm laughing now, so what? You want me to sign a waiver? He laughs along. Ain't say all that, he says, but you do have to hold my hand. And close your eyes. I make a starless night of my face before he asks, "Are you ready?" "Yeah, dog, I'm ready. Sure, let's do this." His rough hand in mine inflates like a blood pressure cuff, and I squeeze back as if we are about to step together from the sill of all resentment and timeless toward the dream source of unneeding. The two of us hurtle, sharing the cosmic breast of plenitude, when I hear the coins blink against the surface, and I cough up daylight like I've just been dragged ashore. "See now, you'll never walk alone," he jokes, and is about to hand me back to the day he found me in, like I was a rubber duck. And he says, "You've got to let go." But I feel bottomless, and I know he means well, though I don't believe it. I feel myself shaking my head no when he means let go his hand. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple of poems from a series that I became fascinated with just the sort of everyday violence that we put up with, that we internalize, the aggressions that we make normal in our lives. And so I have a series of poems dealing with that. And also, my children were much younger at the time I started writing these poems, which took me several years to complete. Problema 3, the number. The Fulton Street food town is playing Motown, and I'm surprised at how quickly my daughter picks up the tune. And soon the two of us, plowing rows of goods steeped in fructose under light thick as corn oil, are singing, "Baby, I Need Your Lovin'," unconscious of the lyrics' foreboding. My happy child riding high in a shopping cart as if she's cruising the polished aisles on a tractor laden with imperishable foodstuffs. Her cornball father enthusiastically prompting with spins and flourishes and the double barrel fingers of the gunslinger's pose. But we hear it as we round the rice and Goya aisle, that other music, the familiar exchange of anger, the war drums of parent and child. The boy wants what? To be carried? To eat the snacks right from his mother's basket? What does it matter? He's making a scene. With no self-interest beyond the pleasure of replacing wonder with wonder, my daughter asks me to name the boy's offense. I offer to buy her ice cream. How can I admit recognizing the portrait of fear the mother's face performs, the inherited terror of nonconformity, frosted with a fear of being thought disrespected by or lacking the will to discipline one's child. How can I account for both the cultural and the intercultural? The boy's cries rising like hosannas as the mother's purse falls from her shoulder, her misstep from the ledge of one of her stilted heels, passion loosed with each displaced hairpin, his little jacket bunched at the collar where she has worked the marionette. Later, when I'm placing groceries on the conveyor belt, and it is clear I have forgotten the ice cream, my daughter tries her hand at this new algorithm of love, each word punctuated by her little fist. Boy, she commands, didn't I tell you? I'll wrap up with this one. This is the fourth in that series. Thank you, by the way. At 13, I asked my father for a tattoo. I might as well have asked for a bar mitzvah. He said I had no right to alter the body he gave me. Aping what little of Marx I learned from the sisters down the street who wore torn black stockings with Doc Martens, I said I was a man because I could claim my body and the value of its labor. This meant I could adorn it or dispose of it as I chose. Tattoos, my father said, are like children. Have one, you'll want another. I knew there was a connection between the decorated body and reproduction. This was why I wanted the tattoo. Yet I reasoned not in so many words. His analogy only held in the case of possession, i.e., I possess my body but cannot possess my children. His laughter was my first lesson in the human Ponzi scheme of paternalism. The self-electing indenture to the promise of material inheritance, men claiming a hollow authority because simply their fathers had claimed a hollow authority. Knowing I had little idea as to what my proposed tattoo might resemble, my father sent me to my room to sketch it using the pastels he had given me for Christmas. Based on his critique, he said he would consider my request. But he'd already taken the shine from my swagger. How can I beautify what I do not possess and call it anything but graffiti? Chris Rock says my first job is to keep my daughter off the pole. Whether or not I agree with him, I get his point. As a father myself, I now see every mutinous claim of independence as the first steps toward my sweet peas falling in with a bad crowd. Richard Pryor says we're bound to screw up our kids one way or another. My father would split the difference. I made you, he'd say. I can unmake you and make another one just like you.
Great, thank you, Craig. All right, we'll now open the floor for questions. Do we have any questions for our speakers?
I'm going to set up here for nothing.
So, this is for Gregory Harlow. I read Totem, actually brought it here with me, and I wanted to know how long it took you to write that book. And I also see that you kind of mix your interests, like, you know, there's a poet, there's a scholarly person there too, so you can talk more about your process and, yeah.
Well, so for the first question, I started writing, I think there's one poem that was in my MFA thesis that ended up in the book. And so that book, and the titles changed, I'm too embarrassed to tell you what the titles were previous to the total. But they were shameful. So the title changed and the book kept changing. I think I did my MFA in 2001. I started sending the manuscript out in 2004 and just kept at it. I was probably a little more ambitious. And I think I started sending it out like 2003. But it kept coming back, of course, and so I kept writing it, kept writing it. So it's from 2001 to 2006, I was basically pretty much writing that book the whole time. It was a constant, and that's kind of what my process is now in general, because I always have like 10 or 15 poems that are in motion, and as I go through my day, whatever comes into, if we're thinking about it, if we're conscious of the things that we're writing, then our day will pick up. We'll pick up cues and material that will end up in the poems. So that's my process. The other question, so I started working on a PhD in 2004. For some crazy reason, I think it's fun to to read a lot of really dense theory for a couple of reasons. One, I genuinely enjoy the feeling of sort of synapses bursting in my head as I'm reading stuff, but also it helps my creative work because it forces me to think in ways that I don't ordinarily think. The same is the case for translation. I translate for the same reason. Well, I started translating for the same reason. I continue to translate because people asked me to do so, but it was primarily an exercise, a writing exercise, getting someone else's voice in my head other than my own, which is routinized, and if I stay with my own voice, I'm just going to keep reproducing the same old stuff. So that was a way to sort of mix up my aesthetic. I tried to, someone told me early on in my academic work that doing a PhD would destroy my creative work. I would no longer be able to be a poet. And of course, my reaction to that is, "Pah! I'll show you." And so I actively pursued poems that allowed me to marry my academic life and my creative life, hence the course descriptions. And I have a couple of poems that are in the form of rare book descriptions. So I'm always looking for new and interesting forms that the form itself speaks in some way and to the content. And different opportunities, ways of bringing together these otherwise incongruous interests.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for Yeah, when you were reading, I wondered what was the attraction for embedding the novel in the year 1974 to be at the point of the revolution in Ethiopia. I recall 1974 is the year of international recession, oil crisis. 1974. That was a serious thing around the world. So I wondered what attracted you to actually embed the novel at that period then? That you visited Ethiopia at that time, or that what was the attraction to actually having the novel at that time?
Okay. I am Ethiopian. So I was born in Ethiopia, so very much this was part of my history. This is partly some of the earliest memories that I have involved the years in the revolution, when the revolution had begun. So I'm emotionally invested in this, even though I don't know a character like Hailu, who was a doctor. The story of this young girl is the story of many people that I know and I knew. So it was in many ways a way, writing this book was a way to exercise ghosts and also to confront some of my own family history. And you're right, 1974, the oil crisis, OPEC, it was one of the reasons that inflation was extremely high in Ethiopia. It was one of the reasons that students decided to get together and have demonstrations of protest, I think, which we're all familiar with the Arab Spring. But, it was this kind of momentum was what created the revolution. But they did not count on something far worse than what was there before taking its place. I've always been interested in this history. And I think as an immigrant, I'm constantly asking, why was I brought here? How did I manage to be in America? And I think most immigrants will always ask, how did I get here? And I've asked that, and that led to research and writing the book.
Another question from myself. I was just wondering, how did the character of Haidu come to you? And were you very conscious about building in a kind of moral ambiguity into things that he does, or that, with the soldiers and other characters in the book?
Yeah, good question. And I'd like to have you talk about moral ambiguity, or moral, maybe in poetry. I think that'd be an interesting thing. I'd love to hear what you have to think of. How did the character of Hailu come to me? I don't know. I did not know a doctor during the revolution. But when I was writing this book, and I hadn't quite figured out Hailu yet, I knew that I wanted to do a story that was based on a family, because one of the questions I've always found interesting in times of civil war or any kind of political conflict is that sense that of being family members, of being connected by blood with people you don't agree with. And so what happens when the stakes are high? We talked about putting what's at stake for characters today. What happens when the stakes are very high, let's say in a revolution, and Hailu has 2 sons, and one of them in my book has joined an underground resistance group. So he becomes a revolutionary. And then you have Hailu, who's trying his best to keep his family together. And then you have his other son, Jonas, who has decided he's going to stay completely out of politics. And I would imagine, what happens when you get those people together at the dinner table? And then you get them together for holidays. And they have to interact, but at night Dawit is off, doing revolutionary things. And Jonas is trying to keep his family safe, and Hailu now is at the hospital. So it's really based on the type of tension I wanted to create that I thought of this family. But I particularly wanted to make a character a doctor, because one of the things for me was who would be in direct contact with the physical consequences of a national movement. Of a revolution, and those are doctors. They are the ones really that deal with the consequences, just like this young girl who's brought to him. So it raised some interesting questions, and the moral ambiguity that you talk about is really where I had to step back as a writer and let Hailu do what he would do. Not what I would do, but what he would do. And all of my characters have to do that. And all of them do things that I may not have done. But I think you have to, as a writer, you have to be willing to, in a sense, be brave enough to let your characters take control of the story. And some of these scenes were really difficult for me to write. But it felt true to what the characters would do, as opposed to what I wanted them to do. I wish I would save the girl. But
Yeah, it's interesting you say you wanted to create the tensions. I think at least in my poems, I'm interested in the tensions that I encounter, and I want to write in that space that's precisely between those tensions, the space that there is no articulation for. Because we can say very simply, I'm jealous, or I'm angry, or I'm ashamed, or I feel guilty, or we can say these kind of large, abstract notions, but it's only when we start to look at those spaces in between where there is no articulation And usually those are the spaces where we actually live, right? Those are the spaces where we're actually feeling anything. It's not the abstraction. And so trying to find the language that fits in those spaces. Well, like with the supermarket poem, for example, I'm fascinated with on the one hand, oh, it's so cute. Look, my daughter's, hit me on the head. Look what she's learned. Wait a minute. That's not cute at all. There's nothing cute in any way about that. It's horrifying, in fact, but it's also funny. And so just the complexity of the moment is where I'm attracted, and I think that's where life is. That's where we are most vital and most present. The abstractions are, it's just the easy kind of distancing words.
Good evening. I have a question that goes to either of you. I'm wondering how you get persons to see. I don't know if it's actually an objective of yours, by the way, but to see somebody else's perspective. Meaning, for instance, you would have spoken about distancing yourself morally from your material. So you're not necessarily writing from your perspective, it might be somebody else's. How can you get readers to actually see that person's perspective? So I'm coming from? Because communicating your perspective is one thing, it's another to have persons, especially, I could use this quote for instance, if, most of us I don't think would be involved in certain things, we won't be involved in gang activity, drug use and those kind of things, but if you're trying to communicate that, it's easy for a reader who is involved in it or has been around it and has chosen not to be involved in it to empathize and understand where you're coming from. But what about persons who don't come from that background? How do you get that and have them understand the morals that persons, hold that are ideas? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Well, when you figure that out, let me know. At some point, you have to have faith in your understanding of human communication. Right? And this is the path that we're all on. Is how do I achieve the right nuances, the right tone, the right imagery, how can I contextualize this thing that I care very much about and have it exist in someone else's mind? All we can be responsible for is what we do on that page. After that, we have to have the generosity of heart, of spirit enough to let the reader come to it as she will. We cannot force, and I think that it does a disservice to the poem and it does damage to the poem when we want to force, when we want to overdetermine what the reader's response is, right? And so the poem or the story should be a welcoming space, an invitation rather than anything of that regard. Because you ultimately, you can't do anything about it.
And I think another thing, when your question, how do you get a reader to go along with, to kind of understand what's happening here? It's because it's about creating characters. You may not know what it's like to be in a revolution, but you will know what it's like to be afraid and to want to protect the people that you love. So it's not connecting them based on action, but it's connecting them based on these emotions that we can all feel. And if you can get that with your character, Hailu, you may not understand what he's thinking as a doctor with this girl, but as a father, you might be able to understand a father's need to protect someone younger than him. And so if I can convey that in the novel, I can get readers to follow along with that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Part of it is determining what is most important for me, the crafter of the thing, the poet, the author. Because what's important is not the situation, the social situation of, for example, gang violence. Right? There's violence everywhere in the world. what's important is my relationship to violence, period, and how I feel. Why am I invested in addressing violence? And it's my story that's going to communicate best to a reader. It's my investment that's going to communicate best. It's my ability to put my own emotional potency in the text that's going to be the thing that attracts a reader. So I think we often get distracted, particularly in poetry, with the context and overlook the heart of the matter, which is always a human element, rather than a political element. Oh, sorry.
Last two questions, we'll jump to one.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the answers that you all gave to the last question. I read a line from a poem by Pablo Neruda, the Chilean nationalist poet. It said, "Between lips and teeth, something goes dying like a bird." But the question I wanted to ask is, I hear in your, George, your explanation about the human element, and so a democracy, a very democratic attitude to the writing of poetry. I have come across on so many occasions where I figure everybody writes poetry. I mean, everybody writes poetry, it seems to me. However, not everybody is allowed to carry that forward or feel good about it. And I want you to speak to that.
Who's okay, allowed? Who's doing the prohibiting?
I think for a lot of people, the prohibiting is how will people take this when I put it out? That's the first thing. So it's a perceived rejection before.
Okay.
But it is also the actual rejections that come in people's statements about their work. Why I say that? We have I teach a course in fundamentals of written English, which has nothing to do with poetry per se, but we allow the students in the journaling that they do to include a couple of and invariably students write poetry. I remember once a student wrote, "I want to have a house, a green house, a red house, a blue house." And I thought, this is so good, but it will not go anywhere.
Where is it supposed to go? and in fact, that's not true because it did go somewhere. And in fact, now it's here.
And it's living here because I say it to you. But she won't get it. I believe, and because of the way when we talk about poetry, that poetry is inter-individual. It can't only stay inside of your yard. And it is when it is given an opportunity to
Well, not everybody wants to share their poetry, right? Well, there are a number of. So to the first point, there's a preconceived, and this is what all poets, every writer deals with, is if I'm doing anything that's worthwhile, then I'm going to be nervous about its reception. The only point, if I'm writing what I think everyone's going to agree with and appreciate, and then it's safe. Then who wants that? Right now, I'm not writing for myself, I'm writing for somebody else. The act of writing a poem is already a provocative act, right? There's already pushback, right? I'm doing something that is not approved by the culture. So I should expect that there's going to, as a writing and publishing poet, first of all, rejection is the majority of the job. You have to just know that that's the case. And part of the journey that is so thrilling for me as a poet is overcoming the shame and fear that I've created. When I do that, it doesn't matter. I mean, there's always going to be a critic. There's always going to be someone who says, well, I didn't like this line, or I didn't like this image, or I don't like you. There's always going to, anytime you put yourself, anytime you risk yourself for the sake of communication, for the sake of reaching out to others, you're risking rejection. That's what makes it worthwhile, right? You're also risking connection. So I hear your concern for your students. I would like to hear from them that concern, right? So I think part of the culture of rejection that we create is telling people that is creating an environment where we should expect to feel self-conscious and afraid of expressing ourselves. So, yeah.
All right, we have one more question, one last question.
Mine is like a follow-on from what you ended with, Gregory, there about politics and poetry, and it applies equally to masses. At one of the panels that in the Biblit Fest that just finished before you guys got here, unfortunately, one of the young poets at the session I was speaking at asked whether we thought that it would be a good thing, this is in terms of sexual difference, you know, non-heteronormative literary expression, to have a kind of, to deliberately write as a, whatever the A may be, as a black person, as a feminist, as a lesbian, whatever. Because it needed saying that such people exist and have, you know, something to say. And I just wonder, when you were talking about balance, you had a political position about it. And you did express that political position through your poetry. But how do you draw the line between that kind of propaganda,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and poetry, or the same with you, Matt? I mean, what you're obviously, it's horribly chilling just from that little bit that you read, what people are capable of doing to each other, and what kindness might actually look like in that situation. But ultimately, it is a criticism. Or we must feel, in a way, very critical of the situation that was allowed to develop in that way and what it did to people and to families. So how do you just bring back that righteous anger?
Well, I'm not advising bringing back the righteous anger. I'm advising finding where the righteous anger is located and writing out of that, as opposed to, because I think we often get these prepackaged kind of political positions, and we're kind of ventriloquized out of those positions, as opposed to finding what is my stake, what is my investment in, my emotional investment, my human investment in this issue. You know, so I don't think it's worthwhile to simply write as a black person, because it doesn't produce anything. It is worthwhile, and this is me speaking, right, opinion-wise, it is worthwhile to speak as a person who often feels alienated. That's a human condition. Right? I think that's the thing that's most worthwhile and what turns it into art. And it's doing the double duty, right?
I think, well, maybe I'll speak in more general terms and then speak specifically to my novel, but I think that if a writer is writing against something, if writing becomes an act of resistance against something, it falls into very real danger of being didactic. And then what do you have left to write about when that entity is gone, right? You can't use this kind of resistance as a foundation for a vocabulary. It has to come from something much bigger than that thing that we're pointing a pen at. In my novel, the first thing I had to tell myself was this was not going to be a political novel. This was not going to be be a novel about politics. This was going to be a novel about a family with very different views within that group, trying to survive in the ways that they know how. What happened to Hailu and this with this young girl gives you one perspective of what happens. So in this particular scene, the soldiers are the bad guys. The regime is the bad guy. But I deliberately also wrote from the perspective of a torturer. And I deliberately chose to include the perspective of a soldier in the book. Part of it is, as much as we have to put our characters at risk, I think as writers, we have to put ourselves at risk when we're writing. It can't be a safe story for us too. And so I had to constantly push myself in ways that felt very uncomfortable to me. But if I'm trying to be as honest to the story, to encompass a period, an era, then I have to move beyond my own skin and walk in the steps of someone else I may not completely like. But between what Hailu does and what a soldier does, or what this torturer does, if lives are ended at the end of a scene, who's worse? And I think those were the questions that I was asking, and not necessarily about politics at all.
Well, thank you, Greg and Maza, for your readings and your responses to those questions. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for coming out tonight. We have copies of Calhoun here on the table for you to peruse as you leave. But thank you for joining us, and participants, we'll look forward to continue to work with you this week. Good night.